Picture this, if you will, the kind of morning that feels like a quiet apology from the universe, where I was sitting on the weathered deck of my floating home at 6 in the morning, a chipped mug of black coffee radiating heat into my palms, watching the dawn stretch its golden fingers across the misty, mirror-like surface of Lake Norman in North Carolina, completely unaware that the fragile peace I had spent a lifetime bleeding for was about to be violently hijacked. For 2 decades, I had been Detective Elias Vance, a man who traded his soul piece by piece to the grim, concrete streets, hunting down the worst kinds of predators for the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, a career that ultimately chewed up my spirit and spat out the remnants of my marriage to Sarah, a woman who eventually realized she loved the stability of my paycheck far more than the ghost of the man who came home to her every night. When the divorce finalized, I took what little I had left, packed my shattered nerves into a duffel bag, and bought the one thing my inner child had always craved: a modest, creaky houseboat moored quietly at the edge of Cypress Point Marina, a rural sanctuary where the exhaust fumes of city desperation were replaced by the rhythmic, soothing hum of diesel generators, the honest groaning of old dock wood, and the mouth-watering scent of thick-cut bacon drifting from the neighboring galleys. Out here on the water, you don't just have neighbors. You inherit a chosen family. Folks who understand the unspoken language of those seeking refuge from the grinding machinery of modern life. There was Ezekiel Harrison, the leather-skinned, perpetually squinting marina owner who was never without his trusty carving knife, whittling intricate wooden birds while spinning tall tales of storms survived. There were Arthur and Helen Carmichael, a pair of sweet, retired school teachers who had funneled 40 years of modest savings into their dream vessel and baked a blackberry cobbler that could genuinely mend a broken heart. And just 3 slips down, there was Mateo and Sofia Delgado, a young, fiercely loving couple who had abandoned the suffocating grip of corporate America to raise their twin 6-year-old daughters with the kind of wild, untamed freedom you can only find on the water. For 8 glorious, uninterrupted months, I slept through the night without reaching for my service weapon. I laughed without a cynical edge, and I finally remembered how to breathe. Until the morning the hurricane arrived, not in the form of swirling dark clouds and rain, but disguised in crisp, designer business suits and the overwhelming, weaponized stench of expensive, suffocating perfume. Her name, she claimed, was Evelyn Blackwood, and she had recently purchased the sprawling, gated lakefront mansion overlooking our humble cove, immediately crowning herself the undisputed, tyrannical queen of a newly fabricated entity she dubbed the Azure Bay Property Coalition. She descended upon our docks with the polished, icy arrogance of someone who genuinely believed her bloated bank account granted her divine authority over the working class, marching down the wooden planks in her impractical heels, clutching a clipboard like it was a scepter, and glaring at our floating community with eyes so full of naked contempt you would think we were a disease infecting her pristine, million-dollar view. At first, it was just a slow, psychological drip of passive-aggressive venom. Complaints about our fishing gear creating visual pollution, sneers directed at the Delgado twins when they laughed too loudly, and slow, menacing drives past our entrance in her immaculate black SUV, pausing just long enough to make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But then, the warfare escalated from icy glares to aggressive, militaristic documentation, as she began invading our sanctuary with camera flashes in the twilight, measuring the distance between our hulls with a laser pointer, and waving around official-looking letters stamped with convoluted, bureaucratic seals that meant absolutely nothing to a seasoned detective, but carried enough visual weight to strike a deep, paralyzing fear into the hearts of trusting, law-abiding people. The real assault, the one that made the dormant, cynical cop inside me snap his eyes open, began on a Tuesday when Evelyn marched down the dock flanked by a man in a spotless hard hat who carried himself with the bloated, theatrical self-importance of a petty dictator, introduced to us as Inspector Barrett from the Municipal Zoning Authority. They moved from boat to boat like a plague, declaring that our community was a floating death trap, citing obscure, fabricated safety violations, and loudly demanding an immediate, on-the-spot cash payment of $300 per vessel for a mandatory compliance assessment to avoid federal eviction. I stood on my deck, leaning against the railing with a casualness I absolutely did not feel, my trained eyes instinctively cataloging every tiny, microscopic tell of a classic, predatory shakedown. I noticed how Barrett chewed his gum with frantic, nervous energy, how his supposedly official tablet was actually just displaying a fantasy baseball roster between fake photos, and how his printed violation forms were typed in a cheap, default font with margins so misaligned they looked like they had been printed in a rush at a local library. When he cornered the Carmichaels, proclaiming their electrical wiring was a catastrophic fire hazard waiting to immolate the entire marina, I saw the blood drain from Helen's sweet, wrinkled face, her frail hands trembling violently as she rummaged through her floral purse, quietly whispering to her husband that they just couldn't afford to make any trouble, pulling out crisp $20 bills from the meager emergency fund they had saved for their grandchildren. The sight of that pure, unadulterated exploitation, the visual of predators feasting on the vulnerability of the kindest people I knew, ignited a dormant, white-hot fury in my chest, a righteous rage I hadn't felt since my days of kicking down doors in the narcotics division. I casually strolled back inside my cabin, my demeanor entirely unbothered, and speed-dialed Officer Higgins, the actual, legitimate county waterways inspector I had shared a few beers with over the summer, asking him offhand if any local homeowners associations possessed legal jurisdiction to enforce structural codes on state-managed waterways. Higgins practically choked on his laughter, reminding me that HOAs possess zero legal authority over navigable state waters, confirming what my gut had already screamed. This wasn't about property values or safety. This was a highly orchestrated, brazen extortion racket designed to terrify and bleed a community dry. When I ran a quiet background check on the pompous man in the hard hat, the truth unspooled exactly as I anticipated. Inspector Barrett was actually a disgraced, unlicensed handyman named Greg Harmon, a known local grifter whose contractor license had been permanently revoked 4 years prior for swindling the elderly out of their roofing repair funds. Stepping back out into the morning sunlight, I activated the hidden recording app on my phone, slipping it into my breast pocket, capturing every veiled threat, every fraudulent demand for cash, and every drop of venom spilling from Evelyn's glossed lips as she pocketed the Carmichaels' money, completely oblivious to the fact that she was committing multiple, undeniable federal felonies: wire fraud, extortion, impersonation of a government official, right in front of a veteran investigator who was already meticulously weaving the rope she would use to hang herself. The escalation didn't stop, because greed like that is a bottomless pit, a hunger that consumes the host until they become reckless, arrogant, and blind to the shadows moving around them. Just days after the fake structural inspection, Evelyn Blackwood returned to our docks at the break of dawn, the morning fog still clinging to the water like a shroud, accompanied this time by a woman wrapped in a pristine, blindingly white lab coat, carrying an assortment of plastic vials and electronic meters that looked impressive only if you had never seen the inside of a real forensics laboratory. This new actor confidently introduced herself as Dr. Julianne Mercer from the Regional Environmental Protection Division, her voice echoing across the quiet water with practiced, theatrical alarm, claiming that an anonymous tip had alerted her department to catastrophic, lethal levels of biological contamination leaking from our houseboat sewage lines, threatening to poison the entire lake ecosystem. As she dipped her cheap, dollar store test tubes into the pristine lake water, holding them up to the morning light with deeply exaggerated, sorrowful frowns, I had to physically bite my tongue to keep from laughing, instantly recognizing her sophisticated chemical testing kit as the exact same over-the-counter pool maintenance set my ex-wife used to balance our backyard jacuzzi. The toxicity levels are beyond critical, the fake doctor announced, her voice pitched perfectly to instill maximum panic, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear, a classic, involuntary deception tell that investigators look for in interrogation rooms. Before delivering the fatal blow, every resident was required to immediately fork over $2,000 in cash for emergency hazmat remediation, or face the total, catastrophic seizure of their homes by federal environmental authorities. Before nightfall, I watched the color completely vanish from Mateo Delgado's face, his eyes darting frantically toward the cabin where his little girls were still sleeping, his shoulders slumping under the crushing, impossible weight of a ransom he could never afford to pay, while the metallic, comforting smell of the marina suddenly felt tainted, poisoned not by sewage, but by the toxic presence of these relentless grifters. Slipping back into my investigative element, the familiar thrill of the hunt humming in my veins, I fired off a secure message to my former partner at the NCSBI, Detective Maya Rojas, a brilliant, no-nonsense analyst who could track a ghost through a blizzard, asking her to run a deep-dive trace on our distinguished scientist. Within an hour, my phone buzzed with the absolute confirmation of my suspicions. Our esteemed Dr. Mercer was actually Samantha Higgins, a disgraced former dental hygienist with a lengthy rap sheet for prescription fraud, and more importantly, a known associate in a sprawling, multi-state racketeering network that had spent the last 3 years moving like locusts across the southeastern seaboard. Digging deeper into the digital dirt, a chilling, infuriating pattern emerged, revealing that Evelyn Blackwood didn't actually exist. Her real name was Elizabeth Thorne, a career con artist and professional parasite currently wanted on active warrants in 4 different states for running identical, devastatingly effective psychological warfare scams on tight-knit, vulnerable waterfront communities. She didn't own the sprawling mansion on the hill. She was renting it under a stolen identity, driving a leased luxury vehicle that was 3 months in arrears, drowning in a mountain of suffocating debt, and desperately trying to squeeze one final, massive payday out of our peaceful marina before fleeing on a one-way, non-extraditable flight to Belize that she had already booked for the following Tuesday. By the time Friday rolled around, the desperation in Elizabeth's camp had mutated into outright lunacy, culminating in the arrival of her most brazen, dangerous prop yet, a man stepping out of a heavily tinted sedan wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform, his chest adorned with a shiny silver badge, introducing himself as Deputy Marshal Trenton with a voice gravelly enough to simulate genuine authority. He slapped a stack of forged, terrifyingly official-looking court orders against the Marina Bulletin Board, screaming that by the power of the municipal courts, any vessel that had not paid their environmental fines and coalition dues by Saturday evening would be violently seized, towed, and sold at auction, and any resident who resisted would be handcuffed and thrown into county lockup for obstruction of federal justice. The collective terror radiating from my neighbors was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket of despair. Children were crying, the elderly were whispering prayers, and the community that had healed my broken soul was fracturing before my very eyes. But as I stared at the fake deputy, noting the cheap, synthetic fabric of his shirt, the incorrect placement of his service radio, and the badge number that I instantly recognized as belonging to a deceased officer from a completely different precinct, the psychological warfare stopped affecting me entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating, and utterly merciless resolve. I didn't want to just scare these predators away so they could set up shop in another state and destroy another family. I wanted to dismantle them, entirely and publicly, trapping them in a web of their own arrogance. I called a secret midnight meeting inside Ezekiel's cramped, wood-scented office, gathering my terrified neighbors around a single flickering bulb, and finally pulled my gold detective shield from my jacket pocket. Watching the expressions around the room shift from hopeless despair to utter, stunned disbelief, I laid out the truth, exposing the entire grand illusion, the fake names, the stolen uniforms, the criminal records, and the impending flight to Belize, transforming my neighbors from helpless, shivering victims into a coordinated, righteous army of undercover operatives. We spent the next 24 hours wiring the entire marina for sound and video, planting microscopic lenses in flower pots and dock pilings, while Mateo used his IT background to establish a secure, encrypted livestream directly to Detective Rojas's command center, setting the stage for a spectacular, theatrical finale that would use Elizabeth's massive, unchecked ego as the very weapon of her own destruction. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, electric tension thick enough to cut with a knife, the humid air of Lake Norman hanging still and quiet as 32 residents crammed themselves into the small, rustic community clubhouse, the only sounds being the nervous shuffling of feet and the distant, rhythmic lapping of dark water against the wooden pylons. Precisely at sunset, the doors swung open violently, and Elizabeth Thorne, still masquerading as the untouchable Evelyn Blackwood, strutted into the room like a conquering emperor demanding tribute, flanked by her entire rogues gallery of fake inspectors, fraudulent scientists, and the counterfeit deputy, all of them completely, blissfully oblivious to the fact that the perimeter of the marina was currently surrounded by 24 heavily armed state troopers and federal agents hiding quietly. In the shadows, "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with an intoxicating cocktail of false sympathy and icy menace, dropping a heavy, metal lockbox onto the center table with a loud, authoritative clang. "Tonight marks the absolute deadline for your federal compliance, and those who fail to submit their total outstanding balances will be immediately removed from these premises by law enforcement. Your properties forfeited to the state." I watched from the back of the room, my arms crossed, suppressing a dark, feral smile as she paced the floor, her eyes glowing with the manic thrill of absolute power, demanding that the residents step forward and empty their bank accounts, their college funds, and their retirement savings into her metal box to appease an imaginary god of bureaucracy. She reveled in their apparent fear, leaning over the table, her gaze locking onto me with a specifically targeted malice, pointing a manicured finger in my direction and sneering. "And you, Mr. Vance, for your constant, irritating insubordination, your vessel will be the very first to be seized and crushed, a permanent lesson to anyone who thinks they can defy the coalition." The room went dead silent, a heavy, breathless pause that felt like it stretched into eternity, the kind of silence that precedes an avalanche, before I finally pushed myself off the back wall, my footsteps echoing loudly against the hardwood floor as I walked slowly, deliberately, right up to her, staring down into her triumphant, arrogant eyes. "The thing about running a long con, Elizabeth," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of a 20-year veteran of the badge, using her real name like a physical strike to the face, "is that you always have to make sure you aren't trying to hustle the one guy in the room who writes the textbook on racketeering." The look of absolute, paralytic shock that washed over her face was a masterpiece, her jaw dropping slightly as I reached into my coat, bypassing my wallet, and smoothly pulled out my leather-bound, Gold State Investigator badge, slamming it down onto the table right next to her metal lockbox with a deafening, authoritative crack. "You are under arrest for extortion, wire fraud, criminal impersonation of law enforcement, and multi-state racketeering," I announced, the words ringing out like a judge's gavel. And as if on a perfectly choreographed cue, the doors burst open, a flood of uniformed state troopers and federal agents pouring into the clubhouse, their tactical lights cutting through the dim room, the beautiful, metallic symphony of handcuffs clicking shut echoing across the walls. The counterfeit deputy tried to make a pathetic dash for the side exit, only to find himself instantly tackled into the drywall by a state trooper, while the fake environmental scientist immediately began sobbing, loudly confessing to everything in a desperate, cowardly bid for immunity, leaving Elizabeth pinned against the table, her designer facade completely shattered, screaming wildly about her rights as the handcuffs bit coldly into her wrists. The clubhouse erupted, not with violence, but with a massive, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated relief. Helen Carmichael collapsed into her husband's arms, weeping tears of joy, while Mateo Delgado hoisted his twin daughters onto his shoulders, cheering as the predators who had terrorized their home were humiliatingly marched out into the blinding glare of a dozen flashing red and blue police lights. In the weeks that followed, the money was recovered from frozen offshore accounts and returned to every single victim. Elizabeth Thorne was slapped with a 15-year federal prison sentence, and our little floating sanctuary on Lake Norman didn't just return to normal. It became stronger, bonded by the fire of shared adversity, a true community where the smell of evening barbecue was no longer tainted by fear, and my own broken, cynical heart finally remembered what it felt like to genuinely protect and serve the people I loved. But as the dust settled and the peaceful hum of the diesel generators returned to the marina, I found myself sitting on my deck late at night, staring out at the dark, rippling water, haunted by a quiet, unsettling thought that refused to let me sleep. If I hadn't been an undercover cop, burnout and hiding in this specific, quiet corner of the world, this entire community, these beautiful, trusting, hard-working people, would have been legally and financially annihilated by a predator armed with nothing more than a clipboard, a fake badge, and the illusion of authority. It leaves you wondering, in a society where a crisp suit and a confident, threatening tone can so easily overpower the truth, how many other quiet communities out there are currently being bled dry in the dark, and when the system designed to protect us can be so easily weaponized by monsters. Where exactly is the line between respecting authority and defending your own survival?
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.